It will be taken from Luke chapter 24, verse 13 through 26. Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you only a visitor to Jerusalem and do not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive, but didn't find his body. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but him they did not see. He said to them, 'How foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?' And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself."
I feel like maybe we should be calling today Gremlin Sunday, but just little issues that were popping up. As I thought about the lesson for this week, because we know that this is the day that the world is remembering the death and resurrection of Jesus, I always think about this story that we just read. And there's some very, very interesting things here, and we'll kind of develop it. But just for those who may not be familiar with how the story flows, that on the Friday that Jesus is crucified, he reaches the point where he breathes his last breath. And sometime after that, before sunset, the soldiers come along. The custom was that for people who were crucified, Jews who were crucified on Friday, that they would come, and if they were not dead, they'd break the legs. And so they came along, and they looked at Jesus, and they thought he was dead, so they pierced his side with a spear just to confirm that he was dead, so they didn't need to break his legs. So Joseph of Arimathea goes to Pilate and asks Pilate for the body of Jesus and puts it into a new tomb that was his own. And the Jewish leaders, it says the next day, went to Pilate saying, this man was saying that he was going to rise from the dead. We think you need to take some kind of precaution. And so the order is for the tomb to be sealed. It's already had the stone rolled in front of it. But he orders for it to be sealed. And I've mentioned this before, but as a kid, I always had this vision of mental image of some, mason there putting, some kind of sealant around it, mortar or, well, what it actually meant was that probably a ribbon or something like that was strung across it, and the Roman seal was put on it. And that meant you cannot touch this without the weight of the Roman Empire coming down on you. That's a pretty serious warning for that. And he also places some soldiers to guard it. So one would assume and think that, okay, this is well protected. Before dawn, or around dawn, on the Sunday morning, there's an earthquake. And the tomb was open, and it says an angel was sitting on top of the stone there. And some of the women come to visit. And they look inside and find the tomb is empty. They go back to the apostles and tell them. And then we have Peter and John and the classic foot race to the tomb that we kind of laugh at in some ways. And there's just a lot of consternation on the part of the apostles and other disciples. You know, what happened to Jesus' body? There is then an appearance of Jesus to Mary Magdalene, who thinks that he's the gardener. But that may not have taken place, or at least not be known, when the story in Luke 24, beginning in 14, of the journey of two of the disciples, one of them is identified as a man by the name of Clopas, to Emmaus. Now, Emmaus was about 7 miles, metric, about 12 kilometers from Jerusalem. And just start thinking about how long it would take to travel that. You know, you're probably thinking prairie. I'm thinking, okay, well, it wouldn't take that long to do that, maybe a couple hours to walk it. But remember, this is an up and downhill kind of a thing. It's not just flat like here. So, who knows how long it would have taken. But as they're walking along, they're talking about everything that's happened, you know, as people do. Now, one of the things that unfolds in this story that I think is really interesting is that for Clopas and this unnamed disciple, they appear to have been much closer to the events than we often realize. Maybe they were part of the 70 that Jesus sent out with the limited commission. You know, they appear to have some almost inside information, and that kind of stands out as we read. So Jesus joins them, and they're prevented. You notice that? They're prevented from recognizing him. And he asks, well, what was it you're talking about? And they're like, you've been around Jerusalem? How can you not know? You know, it's always interesting to ask somebody something, you know, and kind of playing, I want to use the word dumb. You know, that you act like you don't know, or you don't indicate that you really know what's happened. You know, parents, you do that with your kids. You walk in the room and something's happened, you say, what happened? And you know very well what's happened because you've heard it. Maybe even seen it without them realizing. Okay, so when Jesus asks them, and they're stunned by the fact that how could you not know, they begin to go through and relate to him the events that have just happened. And it's always interesting to get that back from other people, to see what they have picked up on, what they understand, what they know. And so they tell, you know, it's kind of funny, they tell Jesus about Jesus and the things that have happened. They referred to him, they said, he was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and before the people. That right there, you know, how could you not know about Jesus? But he was handed over by our religious leaders to the Romans. He was tried, sentenced, and crucified. And I kind of wonder if they may have looked at Jesus kind of with a quizzical expression like, are you sure you haven't heard about this? And then they said, we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And I underline that word hoped because you kind of get the tone from what they're saying and from what they're doing, and we'll see that in just a minute, that they're discouraged. That hope has been completely shattered and broken. It's gone. And what's more, it's the third day since it happened. Now, when we read that, we think of all kinds of things. We think of Jesus saying that on the third day he's going to, that he's going to die and on the third day be raised from the dead. We think of it, how often that is used in the New Testament. They're not thinking that. They seem to be thinking that, this is the third day. This has been all over Jerusalem. You sure you don't know about this? Haven't heard something? And then we get down to really the critical part of what they're telling Jesus. What's more, in addition, some of our women amazed us. All right, and you think about, okay, what would amaze you here? And they say, they went to visit the tomb, and the body was not in the tomb. And they came back and told us they had seen a vision of angels. When people talk about having had some kind of religious experience, the people who are listening to that often are a little dubious, right? Kind of wondering, well, you get enough sleep last night? They've heard the women talk about the tomb being empty. They've heard the women talk about, and you notice that they are relating this about the fact that the women have come back, shared with, and the Gospels tend to say to the apostles, but there are other disciples there, and among them, apparently, Clopas and this other disciple. They're familiar with this. And the angels said to the women that Jesus is alive. So, you're these disciples. You know that Jesus is dead. You've heard the women say, the angels say that he's alive. Anything twigging in your thinking here? So some of our companions, Peter and John, it's kind of interesting. They call Peter and John their companions, went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said. They found it empty. So, given the empty tomb, given the message of the women, given the report of the women, given the message that the angels have conveyed that Jesus is alive, what did Clopas and his buddy do? They left. We kind of think, okay, well, guys, why did you leave? If it's true, why go away? Well, they didn't believe it. That's the simple fact. Even though it came from the women and the angels and even Peter and John, they did not believe it. Well, how do we know? How do we say? Number one, their actions. They left town. They went away. And Luke tells us that as they're walking along, they were downcast. They were sad. They were dejected. Their hope had been broken. The news of the resurrection meant absolutely nothing to them because they didn't believe it. And probably because they didn't think it was possible. And we'll be talking about that in the class in the auditorium this morning with the combined class. People in the first century did not believe in resurrection. So Jesus responds and says, how foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Jesus knew they didn't believe. Even though they had what Jesus had taught during his ministry, even though they had the scriptures. And so he opens their minds to teach and explain the prophecies of the Christ. And as he's doing that, they still don't recognize that this is Jesus. Isn't that interesting? They apparently have been with him for at least part of his ministry, maybe some of the time in Jerusalem, but they still don't recognize him. And as he's telling them, nothing seems to have changed. So they reach Emmaus, they go in, they encourage Jesus to sit down and at the table and to eat with them. And Jesus takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it. And something in their memory says, wait a minute, I've seen this before. This is Jesus. And now they realize who it is. And their eyes are opened. How long has this gone on? We don't know for sure, but it's been a while. And then he disappears from their sight. And so they hurry back to Jerusalem, but they're talking to each other and they say, well, like wouldn't you kind of understand if they were a little bit beating themselves up a little bit? Like, why didn't we recognize him sooner? And they ask, it's a really interesting question. Weren't our hearts burning inside us as he was talking to us? Wasn't this connecting with us in a very personal, very powerful way? And so they return to Jerusalem. And they go to where the apostles are. And what's interesting is you look at the accounts, they're behind locked doors for fear of the Jews. So they've got to be in that inner circle to know where and how to get there and to get in. And so the 11, and understand that the word 11 here is a term that's used like the 12 for the group of the apostles, because we know that Thomas was not there. So it's not a count, it's a term for the group of the apostles. And there are others that are there. And Clopas and his friend are told, it's true. The Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon. He's seen him. He knows he's alive. So now the two disciples report on their encounter with Jesus and say, yeah, we met him on the road to Emmaus and talked with him. And he taught us. And so Jesus now appears in that upper room, or in that room with the apostles. And it's just such a powerful sight. Shows him his wounds. Shows him that he's flesh and blood. There's joy and amazement. It's interesting. That has not happened even with the reports of the resurrection. In some ways it's kind of like an early Thomas. Thomas will say, I won't believe unless I see. Well, they've seen too, and now they believe, and they're amazed and excited. Jesus has some fish with them, and now explains and opens their minds to everything. So what's changed? Well, up to this point, there's been the, quote, vision of angels. The report of the women. And I know this is not politically correct to say today, but in the first century, a report from women would not have been considered to be acceptable. That is really one of the interesting things historically that we look back and say, the only reason for the New Testament to say it is because it's true. Because in the first century world, most people would not have accepted that testimony. But it's true. They know that Jesus was raised from the dead. They had false expectations. They had a worldview that eliminated the idea or the possibility of resurrection. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in the class. And so given all of that, the appearance to Peter begins to change the thinking and the understanding of what has happened. And so the appearance of Jesus, the flesh and the blood, the reality of the resurrection, they have seen him dead. They have now seen that dead flesh is back to life. And against all human hope, against all human understanding, against all human expectation, Jesus has been raised from the dead. And so now he can refocus their view of Scripture. And many of you know that as we teach the Gospels, I like to point out all of the times that Jesus told them, I'm going to be put to death, I'm going to come back to life. And we understand that they're just kind of thinking, well, I wonder what he meant by that. Because they didn't believe it was possible for somebody to come back from the dead. So they're kind of looking for some kind of an allegory, some kind of an image that he's using. But they're just not really understanding that Jesus is talking about coming back from the grave. So now, that hopelessness that they had experienced, that disappointment, the dejection, the discouragement, the brokenness, the frustration, the fear, all being replaced by a totally new thought. God has acted in the world in a way that is unique. Yes, there were times in the Old Testament and even in Jesus' ministry where people who were dead were raised, but usually they were brought back to life on the day they died, Lazarus being the one exception. Religious leaders. There were many religious leaders in the ancient world who were put to death by authorities. And there was no claim for resurrection. It was just not part of the script. God has acted unexpectedly and uniquely. First, in allowing his son to be put to death, and second, after being in the grave on the third day, to be raised to a new life. And the message of the apostles was, we have seen the Lord. We have seen the resurrected Christ. We know he died, and we know he came back to life. And that message of the resurrection became core. And if you look at 1 Corinthians 15, which is, again, part of what we'll be talking about, it's so vital, so important, because Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. He was buried. He rose on the third day according to the Scriptures. Paul knew that was part of the prophecy. That was foretold in the Old Testament centuries before. So as we think about the resurrection today, think of it not as special dinner time, not as candy day, sorry kids, but as the day, well, as Christians, we remember every day that Jesus came back from the grave to show the power and love of God. Let's stand as Riley leads us in our last song.
God sent his son, they called him Jesus.